Welcome to this new installation of our lecture. Previously, I've concentrated heavily on digitization, looking at African policies and how they enable digital rights, freedom of expression online, particularly for activists and journalists and the media fraternity in general. But I've also shared previously lessons from Namibia on doing a thorough assessment on emerging technologies and the potential of developing a country. In this new installation, I will be looking at content moderation, also particularly close and related to technology and digitalization. And I hope you go with me through this topic. The question of self-regulations of platforms through social media council, many of whom are funded by social media companies, had started to make rounds since Facebook, which is now called Meta, has announced the establishment of what it's called the Oversight Board in 2018. The scenario where a global body makes decisions on content takedown at the national level raises the further questions of how self-regulations operates in the context of hyper-globalization, and how this translates to democratic governance and the regulations, which has different shapes in different states. So I'll pause a little bit and just reflect or explain on this context of hyper-globalization. The text itself, or the definition itself, is centered around the dramatic change in the size, in the scope, and the velocity of globalization that began in the late 1990s and that continues even in the 21st centuries. It covers all three main dimensions of economic globalization: cultural globalization and political globalization. It also its impact can make it difficult for a government or for a country to develop democratic governance on its own terms, maintaining its national sovereignty while also achieving deeper international integrated in a hyper-connected world. So what are these social media councils and what role do they play? So social media councils, in this case, will be, for the sake of this lecture, we will be concentrating on the Meta Oversight Board, or the Facebook Oversight Board, or what they also just call as an Oversight Board. Social media councils, like the Meta Oversight Board, serves as a final layer in the content moderation process, in reviewing contested decisions made by the platforms and supposedly offering a fair hearing process to the users whose content and concerns are affected. The legitimacy of these social media councils is established through the expertise and diversities of its members and the independence of the reviewing process and of course the results of their decisions. This journey, for instance, many of these journeys taken by the oversight boards to arrive at either overturning or maintaining or upholding decisions made at the platform level involves a process that is very tedious, but is also supposed to consider local context and international human rights standards. So how does content moderation look like for Africa? So within the sub-Saharan African countries, I've already indicated in my previous lecture, for instance, that digitalization can be clearly linked to new forms of decolonization, with nations struggling to maintain self-determination, local traditions, and local cultures as well as values. And on the other hand, there's an increasing globalized world that sees universal values that are prioritized over local values and local context. And this is particularly taking place online. So I'll reflect a little bit about the Oversight Board's decisions in general. So the Oversight Board endeavors to be independent in its decision-making process. So in understanding that, it's important to reflect on some of the challenges that it faces from a theoretical perspective. One way of thinking of some of these challenges is to draw on this concept called the Internet Governance Impossibility Theorem, which proposes a political trilemma for the world economy that says that one cannot have hyperglobalization, democracy, and national self-determination all at once. This is by Rodlik in 2010. Right? So framed within that role of social media councils and their decision, this approach states that global interconnectedness leads to limitations of democratic and self-determined solutions. A figurative example would be that a country cannot attain decisions reflecting its sovereignty based on local values, including cultural and political nuances, given the digital and the political interconnectedness of the world. So within this context of reviewing contested decisions, this would mean that decisions by global platforms, such as the many of the meta platforms, on local matters might not necessarily be democratic nor reflective of the sovereignty of a particular state. However, from a self-regulation and knowledge structure perspective, or rather, another way to look at is self-regulation within a content moderation framework. We are guided by Mansell and Prof. Robin Mansell and Sternmuller in 2020, who frames that self-regulatory practices of digital platforms have the potential to make private decisions on behalf of the public. And within that framework, it's worth considering that the Meta Oversight Board, for instance, reviews these decisions by platforms that established it and even pays for it, even if these decisions are presented as public decisions. So hence, exploring these Oversight Board intricate decision-making practices and its potential to make decisions that are private in their nature on behalf of the public challenges a key concept that was highlighted by technologist theorist Haggard, who is inclined that specific implications of requiring private corporations must adhere to human rights provisions. So what do these oversight board decisions look like for Africa, or particularly in Southern Africa? So in looking at the oversight board's decisions in the cases from Southern Africa during the 2021 and 2022, we found out that the processes pays very scant attention to local context, values, and regulatory system, and in fact that their decision appears almost exclusively reflect globalized values and approaches to online discourses and democracy. So within many of the oversight boards cases that I will reflect just in a bit, this globalized frame of reference take precedence over efforts to understand the dynamics of social environments within which the cases are taking place. What is even more striking is that they do not make reference to regional, in this case, African human rights framework. So how are the oversight board's decisions transparent or available for the public? I think I've mentioned earlier that within this context, we pay particular attention to oversight board decisions from 2021 and 2022. So number one, the decisions of the oversight boards of Facebook are published on the board's website. And of the 35 decisions that were published between February 2023, only 7 of them originated from the Africa region. That tells us a lot. right? Issues of access, for instance. And theorist Wang and Froldi, 2022, highlights that this lack of geographical diversity in the cases reported from Global South very problematic to a certain extent. They're saying significant geographic regions such as the Sub-Saharan Africa and the Central as well as Southern South Asia represent only 2% of the appeals of decisions by Meta and related companies. So Africa cases account only for 1% of the total number of cases. This might reflect or could reflect little knowledge of or access to the appeal processes by users in the region. So I have here a table that highlights decisions by the Oversight Board to remove content and their natures, for instance. So these are only 7, as I've mentioned before. First case published in 2020 was a video after Nigeria's church attack, and the nature and how it was categorized is violent and graphic content. Obviously, it's from Nigeria and it's a sub-Saharan African case, and its decision was overturned. The next is the Tigray case from Ethiopia. It's flagged as violence and incitement. The other case is reclaiming Arabic words. It was flagged as hate speech, and it's coming from the Middle East and North America case. Fourth case is from South Sudan, and it was also violent and graphic category, and its decision was upheld. And another case was from Ethiopia. The other case was from South Africa. It was flagged as hate speech, and it was also upheld. The last case was from Egypt, Israel and Egypt, and it was flagged as dangerous individuals and organization, and it was overturned. So I'll reflect here again to say that of all these 35 decisions published by Facebook by February 2023, which is this year, only 7 of them, again, has originated from the Africa region. Out of the 7, 3 of these cases were overturned, while 4 of them were upheld. This raises the question of access to the appeal system by people from the Sub-Saharan Africa region, particularly the sub-communities in the countries of origin of the cases who might be affected by the content. So how does the investigation process of maintaining or upholding or overturning the cases of the Meta board, for instance? So as I've mentioned, the Oversight Board does only 2 things. It upholds the decisions already made by platforms, or it overturns those decisions by the platforms. So in doing so, the board considered what they call the Meta's content policy as well as international human rights standards, particularly the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. This international or universal approach is seen to be holding 2 potential challenges, according to Barata, who says that international human rights laws is originally designed to govern relationships of state authorities with individuals and groups, and cannot be used by commercial platforms within state authorities or individuals and groups. And hence, the applications of international laws in local context could also further pose challenges, according to Evelyn Duke, who advocates that international human rights laws in content moderation should rather serve the interest of users and society rather than being co-opted by platforms to their own ends. Hence, this scenario proves the applicability of the Internet Governance Impossibility Theorem, which calls for consensus building in solving local issues at local level. in order to achieve self-determination, but also democracy. So to understand how the Oversight Board's decision relates to democratic governance within the countries of origin of the complaint, it's necessary to look at the political systems in the concerned countries. So for instance, this approach can also help us to reveal how democracy manifests itself at the national level, functions within the context of hyperglobalization. As highlighted earlier, all 5 cases emanate from countries where either war or conflict is or has been currently brewing, and where there's obviously a history of racial violence and divide. So by appealing the decisions of the platforms, for instance, users are always indicating that the content moderation does not show an understanding of their local context. In more direct form, the platform's original decisions were based on its rules and guidelines appears to be one-dimensional. This is where the Oversight Board is intended to provide a broader perspective and consider local context. But in doing that, it still falls short because, amongst others, the Oversight Board uses instruments and institutions detached from the regions of decisions, of where decisions are made, and that makes its decisions unrelatable within the context. However, it also appears that the decisions of the Oversight Boards are also inadequate as they are made based primarily on a framing of issues only based on universal values and laws, even if the context requires deeper cultural, social, and political sensitivity. This is demonstrated obviously by the lack of direct use of local and regional laws, but also institutions in the cases of the hand. By only paying attention to community standards, which is what Meta and their platform claim to be as adequate for users using their platforms, and the application of international human rights law, the Oversight Board reinforces the argument that platforms can undermine the self-determination of people within a national democratic space. So what are the alternatives? An alternative approach would have been, for instance, for the Oversight Board to pay more attention to national legislations and human rights framework, and even regional frameworks, in this case African frameworks, and to convene more regional consultations. This would complement their existing processes by involving local and regional bodies, including NGOs, regulatory bodies, and even digital oversight mechanisms at the African Union level or other relevant regional bodies. They can make decisions that are more respectful of national democratic laws and processes. But traditionally, within the frame of media and media governance, many of the countries have their own media guidelines or media regulations that guides the traditional media framework. Such guidelines can also be used to consider the decisions of the Oversight Board or social media councils. The situation of applying universal laws and values to local context further translate to imposing global laws in the local context and disregarding local and regional guidelines when in place, and laws and indirectly enforcing historical narrative of bigger powers in local matters, and hence recolonialization or digital colonialization. In the case under focuses, for instance, in the cases under focus that I've mentioned before, and informed by the review and decision-making processes, it is clear that the decisions of the Oversight Board did not consider or complement local laws or norms. For instance, in the case of the Tigray Communications Affairs Bureaus in Ethiopia, it becomes a key example here. In this case, we see content created within a specific region where people are disgruntled with the current political situation. And context around that case were not considered, and hence the decision of that case were upheld as made originally by the platform. So this again refrain further challenges. So hence the question of self-regulation with regard to the knowledge structures of Meta and the Oversight Board remains central, as posed by Mansell and Steinmuller, who framed that self-regulatory practices runs the risk of digital platforms making private decisions on behalf of the public. And the Oversight Board makes public decisions based on public processes, but it was set up as a self-regulatory arm of a private entity. So what are some of the recommendations that could answer to the current Africa scenario of content or decisions made about content moderation in general, and the role of the social media councils? The following recommendations hence proposed to address these arguments. That one, that the Oversight Board policies needs to be explicit and intentional in giving consideration to national and regional laws and norms as the first step in dealing with the cases under review. That the Oversight Board should engage directly with multi-stakeholder processes within the country and the region in their decisions as proposed by the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of rights to freedom of opinion and expression in 2009. That the Oversight Board should indicate how and with who their research consultant engaged people and institutions, including media regulators and human rights institutions, in the relevant countries, and reflect this within their case decisions. And that for the Africa region, the Oversight Board should demonstrate its inclusion of engagement with the regional laws and regional bodies as a necessity in trusting that their processes are focused in dealing with local context, and this will ensure transparency and build the legitimacy of regional oversight structures and internet-related human rights norms and standards. And finally, the Oversight Board should invest heavily in awareness campaign in Africa about their appeal procedures for their cases, as well as the mechanism of which public input within the investigation process is sought after. We end here, and when we come back with our next impartation of the lecture, we will focus on safety online for marginalized groups. I thank you.